Billionaire woman slap and humiliated judge in court. His sentence leaves everyone stunned. The courtroom buzzed with hushed whispers, the tension in the air palpable as spectators filled the wooden benches. It was a high-profile case that had captured the nation's attention. In the front row, reporters jotted notes and adjusted their cameras, eager to capture every detail. Judge Harrison, a towering figure with a stern expression, presided over the court with an air of unshakable authority. He had a reputation for being ruthless, often wielding his gavel like a weapon to silence those who dared to challenge him. Today, his piercing gaze scanned the courtroom, landing momentarily on a woman who sat with an unassuming calm in the defendant's chair. That woman was Eleanor Graves, a billionaire entrepreneur known for her philanthropy and business acumen. Dressed in a simple yet elegant black dress, she seemed out of place amidst the chaos of the courtroom. Her demeanor was composed, her face unreadable, as if she were simply an observer rather than a participant. The murmurs around her suggested disbelief. What could a woman of her stature have done to warrant being here? Judge Harrison's gavel struck the podium, silencing the room. "Order in the court!" he barked, reverberating off the walls. His eyes narrowed as he addressed Eleanor. "Ms. Graves, you stand accused of contempt of court. Do you understand the gravity of these charges?" Eleanor's gaze met his, unwavering. "I do, Your Honor." Her voice was calm and measured, betraying no emotion. The judge's lips curled into a faint smirk. He relished moments like these, where he could remind even the most powerful individuals that the courtroom was his domain. "Very well. Let the proceedings begin." The courtroom's air grew heavier as the first witness, an assistant prosecutor, stepped forward. He was young, sharp, and carried himself with a confidence that mirrored Judge Harrison's authority. A few papers were shuffled as he approached the stand, his every movement deliberate. The audience leaned forward in unison like a tide inching closer to shore. "Your Honor, I will demonstrate that Ms. Graves not only disregarded court orders but displayed flagrant disrespect for the judicial system," he began, his voice carrying an edge meant to cut through Eleanor's calm facade. His words were sharp, yet Eleanor's expression remained serene as if he were speaking to the room rather than to her. Judge Harrison's steely gaze bore down on Eleanor. "Ms. Graves, you'll have your opportunity to respond. For now, I advise you to listen carefully," he warned, his tone icy. The assistant prosecutor called upon a junior clerk, whose hands trembled as she held a folder of documents. The clerk, barely out of law school, looked overwhelmed but determined. She recounted an incident in which Eleanor had allegedly ignored a subpoena, presenting it as a deliberate affront to the court. And yet, Ms. Graves continued her activities as if she were above the law. The prosecutor pressed, turning to Eleanor with a slight sneer. "Does that sound like the actions of someone who respects this institution?" Before Eleanor could reply, Judge Harrison intervened, his voice booming. "Ms. Graves, you will refrain from responding until instructed. This court's order is final." His gavel struck with authority, the sound echoing like thunder. The tension escalated when the prosecutor presented emails and correspondence as evidence. He meticulously described each exhibit, weaving a narrative that painted Eleanor indifferent to the rules. Once buzzing with whispers, the audience sat frozen, hanging on every word. Each accusation landed like a pebble in still water, ripples of shock spreading through the room. "Your Honor," the prosecutor concluded, "the evidence is clear. Ms. Graves flaunted her influence, believing it would shield her from accountability. Such behavior undermines the integrity of our legal system." Judge Harrison nodded grimly. His gaze shifted back to Eleanor, his expression a blend of disdain and expectation. "Ms. Graves, these are serious accusations," he intoned. "Do you comprehend the severity of your actions?" For a moment, Eleanor's calm faltered. She adjusted her posture slightly, clasping her hands in front of her. It was the smallest of movements, yet it caught the audience's collective breath. When she spoke, her voice was soft but unyielding. "I do, Your Honor. And I am prepared to address each allegation in turn." Her words, measured as they were, did little to deflate the judge's simmering ire. "Let's hope your explanations are as thorough as your reputation suggests," he remarked, a hint of mockery threading his tone. Eleanor's legal counsel, a seasoned attorney named Victor Stokes, rose to his feet, his sharp suit glinting under the fluorescent lights. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth and calculated, "my client's intent was never to undermine the court. If you allow, we will demonstrate that the accusations lack the necessary context to fully understand the events." Judge Harrison's glare cut through Victor's confidence. "You'll have your chance, counselor. But I'll warn you now, any attempt to dance around the facts will not be tolerated." His words hung in the air like a blade poised to strike. Victor nodded, taking his seat as Eleanor cast him a glance that was equal parts gratitude and trepidation. Despite her composed exterior, the cracks were beginning to show. The weight of the accusations, the relentless prosecution, and the judge's unyielding scrutiny were taking their toll. As the next witness was called, the atmosphere in the courtroom thickened further. This time, it was a former associate of Eleanor's, a man whose presence drew sharp whispers from the spectators. He strode to the stand with an air of purpose, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the clerk before him. His testimony would either cement Eleanor's downfall or unveil a surprising twist. The audience braced themselves, feeling the storm brewing just beneath the surface. The atmosphere in the courtroom was charged as the former associate, Gregory Langston, settled into the witness stand. His presence alone sent ripples through the audience, a man once closely tied to Eleanor Graves, now poised to testify against her. His tailored suit and confident demeanor suggested he relished the moment, an opportunity to bring his former mentor down a peg. Judge Harrison's sharp voice broke the murmurs that had started to rise. "Mr. Langston, state your relationship with the defendant for the court," he commanded. Langston leaned forward, his voice smooth but laced with underlying malice. "I was Ms. Graves' strategic advisor for nearly a decade. We worked closely, and I had access to the inner workings of her empire." The assistant prosecutor nodded approvingly, stepping closer to the stand. "Mr. Langston, during your time with Ms. Graves, did you observe behavior that suggested a disregard for legal authority?" Langston's lips twitched into a faint smirk. "I did. Eleanor always believed she was above the rules. There were numerous occasions where subpoenas were ignored or meetings with regulators were delayed because, as she put it, time was better spent elsewhere." The words hung in the air like a guillotine, and a collective murmur of judgment rippled through the audience. Eleanor's composed facade remained, but her fingers tightened imperceptibly on the edge of the defendant's table. Victor Stokes, seated beside her, glanced at her briefly before turning his gaze back to the stand. He was preparing to counter but knew timing was everything. "Mr. Langston," the prosecutor continued, "can you provide specific examples of this behavior?" Langston leaned back slightly, exuding confidence. "One instance comes to mind. There was a court order involving one of her development projects. Instead of complying immediately, Eleanor instructed me to prioritize the project's timeline and deal with the legal mess later. She even joked that her lawyers were paid to clean up after her." The prosecutor's eyes gleamed as if Langston had handed him the final piece of a damning puzzle. "And was this a common attitude in her operations?" Langston nodded. "Absolutely. Eleanor Graves operates on the belief that the rules apply to everyone but her." Judge Harrison's penetrating gaze fell on Eleanor. "Ms. Graves, do you have anything to say about these accusations?" Eleanor rose gracefully, her every movement calculated. "Your Honor, I do. While I acknowledge Mr. Langston's claims, I'd like to remind the court that his perspective is shaped by his dismissal from my company for unethical behavior." A sharp intake of breath swept the courtroom. Langston stiffened, his smirk faltering. Eleanor continued, her voice steady. "I'll admit, I've made decisions that prioritize efficiency, but I've always operated within the bounds of the law. Mr. Langston's testimony conveniently ignores his conduct, which I have documentation to prove." Judge Harrison rapped his gavel. "Both parties will refrain from turning this into a personal vendetta. The court will examine the evidence without bias." Victor seized the opportunity. "Your Honor, I request to cross-examine Mr. Langston and submit the mentioned documentation." The judge's eyes narrowed. "Proceed." Langston's confidence visibly wavered as Victor approached the stand. The power dynamic shifted, setting the stage for a battle of wits that would redefine the courtroom's focus. Victor Stokes approached the witness stand with the measured precision of a seasoned litigator. His tailored suit glinted under the courtroom lights as he held Langston's gaze, his expression a blend of professionalism and controlled intensity. "Mr. Langston," Victor began, his voice smooth but firm, "you testified that Ms. Graves instructed you to prioritize project timelines over legal compliance. Is that correct?" Langston shifted in his seat, the confidence from earlier dimming slightly. "Yes, that's correct," he replied, his tone a touch defensive. Victor smiled faintly, as though inviting Langston into a trap he hadn't yet realized was set. "And during your tenure at Graves Enterprises, were you not the head of strategic operations? Specifically tasked with ensuring that all projects adhered to legal standards?" Langston hesitated, glancing toward the assistant prosecutor for reassurance. "Yes, but I can only work within the directives I'm given." "Interesting," Victor said, turning to the jury. "Mr. Langston, do you recall an internal memo dated March 15, 2022? The one in which Ms. Graves explicitly outlined her expectation that all legal and regulatory standards must be met before proceeding with any project?" Langston's jaw tightened. "I'd have to see the memo to confirm." Victor nodded to his assistant, who swiftly handed him a document. He approached the witness stand, holding the paper up for Langston to see. "Allow me to refresh your memory." He paused for effect. "This memo, bearing your initials as the recipient, clearly states, 'No project shall move forward unless it complies fully with all applicable laws and regulations. Non-compliance will result in disciplinary action.' Does that sound familiar?" Langston's face flushed. "I don't recall the exact wording, but yes, that memo was sent." Victor's voice sharpened. "So you were aware of Ms. Graves' commitment to legal compliance, yet you're now claiming she directed you otherwise? Could it be that your interpretation conveniently shifts blame away from your lapses?" The audience's murmurs grew louder, a ripple of doubt washing over the courtroom. Judge Harrison struck his gavel. "Order!" Langston leaned forward, his confidence unraveling. "Look, all I'm saying is that there was pressure to get things done quickly. Maybe I made some calls that weren't ideal, but I was following the tone set by Ms. Graves." Victor pressed on, his voice steady but relentless. "Mr. Langston, isn't it true that you were terminated from Graves Enterprises for falsifying expense reports and mismanaging project budgets?" Langston stiffened. "That was a misunderstanding. The numbers were reconciled." "A misunderstanding," Victor repeated, his tone dripping with skepticism. "And yet your termination was upheld after an internal review, and you were denied severance due to gross misconduct. Isn't that correct?" Langston's silence was deafening. His eyes darted nervously toward the assistant prosecutor, who avoided his gaze. Victor stepped back, addressing the jury directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we're seeing here is not the testimony of a credible witness but the calculated words of a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge. Mr. Langston has demonstrated a willingness to distort the truth to suit his narrative. Keep that in mind as you weigh his testimony." The judge's gavel struck again. "Mr. Stokes, you've made your point. Let's proceed." As Langston left the stand, his head bowed slightly, the assistant prosecutor scrambled to regain control of the narrative. He called another witness, a former project manager, to corroborate Langston's claims. However, the cracks in their case had already begun to show. This new witness, though earnest, faltered under Victor's incisive cross-examination. "Ms. Patel," Victor said, addressing the project manager, "you've stated that Ms. Graves often prioritized efficiency. Would you say that this focus was unusual for someone leading a major corporation?" Patel hesitated. "No, but sometimes it felt like we were cutting corners." "Cutting corners?" Victor repeated, his brow arching. "Or was it that deadlines were tight and resources limited, as is common in high-pressure industries?" "I suppose that's a fair assessment," Patel admitted reluctantly. Victor's voice softened, but his words carried weight. "Ms. Patel, in your time at Graves Enterprises, Did you ever see Ms. Graves explicitly instruct anyone to violate the law? Patel's answer came quietly. No. Thank you. No further questions. Victor returned to his seat, glancing at Eleanor. She met his gaze with a faint nod of gratitude, her calm exterior intact but her eyes betraying a flicker of relief. The prosecution's case was beginning to fray. Judge Harrison, ever vigilant, observed the proceedings with a calculating eye. The courtroom's energy had shifted, the audience sensed the tides turning. Eleanor's composed demeanor now seemed less like arrogance, and more like the quiet assurance of someone unjustly accused. As the day wore on, the assistant prosecutor called one final witness, a compliance officer who had worked on one of Eleanor's controversial projects. The testimony was intended to deliver a final blow, but Victor was prepared. His cross-examination dismantled the claims with surgical precision, pointing out inconsistencies and highlighting the officer's lack of first-hand knowledge. When the court adjourned for the day, the tension was palpable. The prosecution had started strong but now seemed on shaky ground. Eleanor's quiet confidence and Victor's meticulous strategy had begun to sow doubt among the jury. As Eleanor walked out of the courtroom, escorted by her legal team, whispers followed her like a shadow. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, the scales seemed to tip in her favor. The courtroom was silent, the air heavy with anticipation as the final piece of evidence was introduced. Victor Stokes approached the bench with deliberate care, carrying a slim, sealed envelope. He held it aloft, ensuring every eye in the room followed its journey. Your Honor, Victor began, his voice steady but charged with purpose. This document is an affidavit from a former senior executive at Graves Enterprises. Its contents will cast significant doubt on the prosecution's claims and shed light on the motives behind this case. Judge Harrison's piercing gaze locked onto Victor. Proceed, but be concise, he instructed, rapping his gavel lightly. Victor opened the envelope with precision, extracting a neatly folded affidavit. Clearing his throat, he addressed the courtroom. The affidavit states that Gregory Langston, the prosecution's key witness, was involved in a scheme to embezzle funds from a major development project. When his actions were discovered by Ms. Graves, she terminated his employment and initiated an internal investigation, which uncovered further misconduct. Gasps rippled through the audience. Langston, seated among the spectators, paled visibly. He shook his head vehemently, but his earlier confidence had drained away. Victor continued, raising his voice slightly to cut through the murmurs. Furthermore, the affidavit reveals that Mr. Langston has since attempted to discredit Ms. Graves in multiple forums, providing fabricated accounts to undermine her credibility. These actions coincide with the timeline of the allegations presented by the prosecution. The assistant prosecutor shot to his feet. Your Honor, this is a desperate attempt to deflect from the charges at hand. The witness cannot defend himself against these claims without proper notice. Judge Harrison raised a hand to silence him. Mr. Stokes, do you have corroborating evidence to support this affidavit? Victor nodded, his movements deliberate. Yes, Your Honor. Attached to this affidavit are financial records, signed correspondence, and a summary of the internal investigation conducted by Graves Enterprises. Each document substantiates the claims. The judge leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. He scanned the courtroom before fixing his gaze on Langston. Mr. Langston, do you wish to respond? Langston stammered, words tumbling incoherently before he fell silent. The courtroom's energy shifted, the audience now leaning toward Eleanor's side. Eleanor remained composed, her hands resting lightly on the table. A faint, knowing smile crossed her lips, not of triumph, but of relief. The truth, it seemed, was finally catching up to her accusers. As the truth unfurled, the courtroom's energy shifted dramatically. Gregory Langston, the prosecution's star witness, now sat hunched in his chair, his earlier bravado completely shattered. The damning evidence presented by Victor Stokes had turned the tide, and whispers rippled through the audience as the weight of Langston's duplicity settled over the room. Judge Harrison sat silent for a long moment, his face a mask of contemplative neutrality. Then, with a sharp rap of his gavel, he spoke. This court takes accusations of perjury and fabrication with the utmost seriousness. Mr. Langston, your testimony has been called into question, and the evidence presented paints a troubling picture. Bailiff, detain Mr. Langston for further investigation into his statements and conduct. The room erupted in murmurs as the bailiff approached Langston, who began to protest loudly. This is a mistake. She's manipulating the system, he yelled, but his words fell on deaf ears. The bailiff placed a firm hand on Langston's shoulder, silencing him as he was led away. Meanwhile, the assistant prosecutor scrambled to salvage his case. He stood abruptly, his voice strained as he addressed the judge. Your Honor, while these revelations about Mr. Langston are concerning, they do not negate the broader pattern of behavior we have outlined regarding Ms. Graves. Judge Harrison raised a hand, cutting him off. Mr. Davis, your case hinges on credible testimony. Without it, the integrity of your argument is severely undermined. I suggest you take a moment to reassess your position. Victor Stokes seized the opportunity to press forward. Rising from his seat, he spoke with measured authority. Your Honor, my client has endured a relentless campaign of baseless accusations. The evidence presented today not only exonerates her but exposes a concerted effort to tarnish her reputation. We request an immediate dismissal of these charges. The judge considered this, his eyes flicking to Eleanor, who sat composed and silent. Her calmness now seemed less like defiance and more like vindication. Ms. Graves, he said, addressing her directly, do you have anything to add before I make my ruling? Eleanor stood, her movements slow and deliberate. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady but carried an undercurrent of emotion. Your Honor, I have always respected the judicial process. Today's proceedings have been difficult, but I am grateful for the opportunity to clear my name. I trust in this court's ability to see through the deception and recognize the truth. Judge Harrison nodded, his expression softening ever so slightly. He turned to the jury, his voice firm. Ladies and gentlemen, based on the evidence and testimony provided, it is clear that the prosecution's case has been compromised. I am dismissing the charges against Ms. Graves. This court is adjourned. The sound of the gavel striking echoed through the room, followed by a collective exhale from the audience. Eleanor's legal team erupted into quiet celebrations, shaking hands and exchanging triumphant glances. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, their pens flying across notepads and cameras flashing in rapid succession. As Eleanor gathered her belongings, Victor leaned in, his voice low but filled with pride. You handled that with remarkable grace. It's not every day you see a case like this turned around so decisively. Eleanor offered him a faint smile. I've had years of practice staying composed under pressure. But thank you, Victor. I couldn't have done this without you. Outside the courthouse, the scene was chaotic. A crowd of supporters and detractors had gathered, their voices blending into a cacophony of cheers and jeers. Eleanor paused on the steps, her head held high as she faced the press. Ms. Graves, do you feel vindicated? One reporter shouted. What's your message to those who doubted you? Another chimed in. Eleanor raised a hand, silencing the noise. I have always believed in the power of truth, she said firmly. Today's outcome is a testament to that belief. While this experience has been challenging, it has only strengthened my resolve to continue my work and uphold the values I've always stood for. Her words struck a chord, and the crowd's energy shifted, many breaking into applause. Eleanor turned and descended the steps, her legal team flanking her as she made her way to a waiting car. As the vehicle pulled away, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. The battle had been hard-fought, but justice had prevailed. In the days that followed, the fallout from the trial sent shockwaves through the media and corporate circles. Langston's credibility was thoroughly dismantled, and new investigations into his actions began. Eleanor, meanwhile, saw her reputation not just restored but elevated, her resilience and poise during the trial earning her widespread admiration. Despite the victory, Eleanor knew the scars from this ordeal would linger. But as she sat in her office, surrounded by supportive messages from friends and allies, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The trial had tested her in ways she never imagined, but it had also reaffirmed her strength. And with that strength, she was ready to face whatever came next. The trial was over, the dust had settled, and Eleanor Graves sat in her office, staring out at the city skyline. The late afternoon sun bathed the room in a golden glow, but her thoughts were heavy. The court victory had been decisive, but it wasn't just the win that lingered in her mind, it was the lessons learned along the way. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her reverie. Victor Stokes stepped in, his presence as commanding as ever. He carried a leather-bound folder under his arm, but his expression was softer than usual. "You have a few minutes?" he asked. Eleanor gestured to the seat across from her desk. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Victor settled into the chair, setting the folder down. "I wanted to talk about everything that's happened. Not just the case, but what comes next." Eleanor nodded, folding her hands in her lap. "It's been a lot to process. I've spent years building my company, and my reputation, thinking that integrity alone would protect me. This trial showed me that even when you do everything right, there will always be those who try to tear you down." Victor's brow furrowed. "True. But you also proved something important, that resilience and truth can prevail, even in the face of calculated deception. The way you handled yourself in that courtroom inspired more people than you realize." She sighed, her gaze drifting back to the window. "I learned that silence isn't always the answer. For too long, I've let my work speak for itself, thinking that was enough. But sometimes you have to speak up, confront lies directly, and trust that the truth will resonate." Victor leaned forward, his tone thoughtful. "And sometimes the greatest impact isn't in defending yourself, but in setting an example. Your composure, your refusal to stoop to their level, showed everyone what true strength looks like." Eleanor turned to him, a faint smile playing on her lips. "It wasn't easy, you know. There were moments I wanted to lash out, to fight fire with fire. But that would have only validated their narrative. Instead, I focused on what mattered, presenting the truth and staying true to my principles." Victor nodded. "That's a lesson worth sharing. People need to see that power isn't about control or dominance. It's about integrity, about lifting others instead of tearing them down." Eleanor tilted her head thoughtfully. "You're right. This ordeal has taught me the importance of mentorship, of guiding others so they don't have to face these battles alone. I've been so focused on the macro, on building my empire, that I've neglected the individual lives I can impact directly." Victor smiled. "Then maybe that's what comes next. Using your voice and your platform to empower others." Eleanor nodded slowly, the weight of the conversation settling into clarity. "This isn't the end, Victor. It's the beginning of something bigger. If this trial has taught me anything, it's that adversity can be a catalyst for growth, not just for me, but for everyone watching." As Victor stood to leave, Eleanor rose with him. She extended a hand, which he shook firmly. "Thank you, Victor. For everything." He smiled. "You're more than welcome. But the real work starts now." As the door closed behind him, Eleanor felt a renewed sense of purpose. This experience had been a crucible, forging her resolve to not only rebuild but to inspire others to rise above challenges with dignity and strength. It wasn't just her fight anymore. It was a call to action for everyone who believed in the power of truth and resilience. The weeks following the trial were transformative for Eleanor Graves. The world now saw her not as a billionaire entrepreneur under scrutiny, but as a symbol of resilience and integrity. Her public appearances were met with admiration, her speeches inspiring individuals to face their challenges with courage. One such event was the launch of her new initiative, the Foundation for Ethical Leadership. The auditorium was packed with a diverse crowd, young professionals, seasoned leaders, and students hungry for guidance. Eleanor stood at the podium, her presence commanding yet approachable. "The past few months have tested me in ways I never anticipated," she began, her voice steady. "But they've also reinforced a truth I've long held: strength isn't measured by how we avoid challenges, but by how we face them. It's in our ability to stand firm, to hold on to our principles even when the world questions us." She paused, scanning the crowd. This foundation isn't just about rebuilding what was nearly taken from me. It's about creating opportunities for others to rise, to lead with integrity, and to ensure that justice prevails in all corners of our society." The applause was thunderous, a testament to the impact of her words. In the front row, Victor Stokes watched with a faint smile, his belief in Eleanor validated yet again. As the crowd dispersed, Eleanor lingered for a moment, taking in the atmosphere. This wasn't just a victory for her. It was a step toward a broader mission, a chance to turn adversity into a force for good. Walking off the stage, she felt lighter and more purposeful than ever. The trial had ended, but a new journey had begun. And this time, she wasn't just rebuilding her legacy, she was shaping a future that resonated far beyond herself.